No, I think they had an agenda to announcing it. And that's why it was so hard to really wrap my mind around the emotion. And it was more of shock than anything. It felt like the persona was like, oh, well, if you're really in tune with God, you can do everything that we ask of you.
And it also warps your view of God.
Yeah.
It makes God as materialistic and superficial as you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, God is only concerned about like the pile of gold in my backyard.
Yeah.
Like how big my house is. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Escaping 350 podcast. I have a very special guest today, Elizabeth Morgan, who happens to be my sister-in-law.
Hello.
Very excited to have her on and share her story. As you'll hear in the podcast here in a moment, she obviously attended the same church that my wife and I and the rest of her family did. She grew up in this church, which we now know quantifiably, I think, is a cult. And this is why I think it's important for us to have these discussions to expose some of the bad behaviors that are prevalent in high control authoritarian churches. And Elizabeth will share more to that here in a moment. But I just wanted to introduce Elizabeth. So thank you again for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you for having me. I'm very, very excited to be here. It's just super exciting to share the story that we all have, Very exciting.
Excellent. Yes, I'm excited as well. And I know some of the subject matter, obviously, while we're excited to share the story, a lot of it was traumatic.
Yes.
And I think that's why it's important that we have these conversations, because when we don't share these stories and we hide it, people are told to kind of, stuff it down inside and don't express it. That protects and favors the people that are perpetrating the spiritual abuse and the harm. And so I think what you're doing today is very commendable. And so, again, thank you for coming on and sharing your story, even though I know some of the subject matter is going to be a little tough. And if you're familiar at all with Escaping 350, you'll know kind of along the lines of what we'll be discussing today. But Elizabeth has a very important story. So anything you want to share before we go into it?
No, I think I'm okay. I think I'm just ready to share the story, ready to put it out there, just get it off my heart, It's a testimony, and it's something that we really, really need to tell, because a lot of people go through it and never get to tell their story. And I'm really, really deeply, excited to share that.
Yes. And I think people who share their story, it opens the door for others in a similar situation to share their story as well.
Of course.
So, as I mentioned earlier, of course, you attended and grew up in the church that we both escaped. Mm-hmm. But obviously early on, we didn't really have any inclination that there was anything wrong with the church. And so my first question is, could you share a little bit about your early childhood growing up at First Church? And, what were some of your earliest memories just as a young person, a child growing up in First Church?
Yeah, of course. First off, it was like growing up, it was like just a normal church, and it was super loving and, well, as we thought, loving and, caring. And, growing up in it, we, had so many rules, but I was like, it's like family, and, sometimes we have rules in families, but we didn't think anything of it. And growing up, it was just like having something to hold on to, and always wanting to be a part of something, even at a young age, 5 years old, I was already, spoken about and being there. I was trying to help in any way I could because I loved being a part. I loved putting myself out there and enjoying, what I could do for people, and not just for people, but for God, you
Yes.
know? And that's what I wanted to be put out there is like, I love God. I love God. And, we want to share that with so many people. And, I just feel like growing up so much of different rules, you start to wonder, all the different things that, well, what can I do or what can I not do,
Right.
And those are the questions, you have, but sometimes couldn't ask.
Yes. And so I think you bring up a really great point. That's one of the things that the church gears you towards, right? Like from an
Yeah.
early age, they integrate you right away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a unique vantage point that you have because you grew up in it, right?
Yeah.
You really don't know much outside of that. The same with me. I grew up in the UPCI,
Mm-hmm.
not at our particular church, but I mean, as soon as you're able to contribute in some sort of way, they embed it in your mind
Yeah.
that it's your responsibility to contribute
Mm-hmm.
in whatever way you can. And they use words like, you have to use your talents for the greater cause. You have to use it for the church and for ministry.
Exactly.
And so it's interesting that like right from out the gate, you're already being put into the trenches, if you will, into ministry and then helping your parents. And, I was witness to that. So
Yeah.
I can attest.
There every Sunday through Saturday sometimes, and we were
Yeah.
like tired as hell, but it just having those things, it's like we were feeling a part,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, oh, I have a role, and some kids, like, that's the only part they have, and it's like, well, if I have a part in this, maybe I, what can I do to help, and being so young, it's like, oh, it's so exciting, and well, all the different things that you can do, that they
Yeah.
put offer,
And it showcases how that is your community, right? And there is good. Don't get me wrong. Like a lot of people, when they discuss deconstructing from the church, well, they want to throw out the church altogether and say, okay, well, there's no benefit of coming together. But I'm sure your memories are fond, even though that the being in ministry is tasking, especially in our specific tradition. They ask a lot and for little in return, and you're expected to do it.
Exactly.
But it becomes so enmeshed, your responsibilities to the church and your community, that they become one and the same.
Yeah.
It's hard to distinguish, okay, I'm here to clean up the church, but this is where I connect with people. This is my family, right? And so you learn, because I remember as a teen, when we'd come to the church for like church cleaning days, I never saw it particularly as like work, if you will.
Yeah.
Because I was always looking forward to like goofing off with my friends, right? Or like
Absolutely.
doing like a haphazard job. And it's just part of the culture.
Yeah.
But that kind of exacerbates as you grow up later into an adulthood where they start putting more responsibilities until it's like you start to feel burnout.
Exactly.
And so you were at the very beginning of your childhood, you were already thrown into that. Whereas some people come into the movement in their adulthood and don't realize it until much later. So that leads into my second question here. What was your family's relationship to the church? And how involved were they? And you kind of alluded to that already. And then lastly, how much did that influence your day-to-day life as a kid?
So first, like, they were involved everywhere, like growing up, we were involved in prayer and all different types of ministry. And that's where it was like, oh, we have these opportunities to do, anything, and it's like, well, my dad specifically would love to volunteer all of us, and I was like, oh, what are we gonna do now, but then at times, like growing up, it was like, okay, I don't know if I want to do that though, but you can't really question,
Right.
and so you just do it anyways. And like you said, like, you do get burnt out, and you're like, well, if I'm pushing myself to do this, how is it to anybody else, and trying to involve all your family. You know, it was all of us, all 6 of us, always there, always present, and trying to do everything.
Right.
You know, it was prayer. You know, we would go from 8 a.m. to like close to 3 p.m. and we're like, Dad, we're starving,
Yeah.
know? And it's like trying to do everything for everybody else. And, you know, we loved it. But then it's also like, when was there a break?
Right.
And you never really got the chance to say, hey, I don't feel good today. Or, hey, you know, we need to step back. And we never got a chance to. And that's where it's like being involved. It was so exciting, but at times it was like so draining.
Yeah.
And mentally, you know, growing up, it was just like, yes, it was exciting and everything, but also trying to do it every single Sunday, Wednesday, Friday, you know, doing it all was so emotionally like impacting, but also like in a way where you're like, okay, how do I feel when I'm burnt out?
Right.
You know?
I think, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
One of to add context to that story, the prayer meeting I recall, and you brought it to my memory. I think it illustrates kind of how off the rails the UPCI culture, Pentecostal culture in general, can sometimes go, because that I think that prayer was like in a response to, it was like a pre prayer.
Yeah.
Right. So like the church came together as what was known as corporate prayer. And then your dad was helping lead a prayer before corporate prayer, which was before service.
Yes.
Right. So you have to imagine, you know, how old were you at the time?
I think it was around 12, I believe.
Yeah.
So it's pretty young.
Yeah. I mean, and it's hard for you at that age to wrap your mind around what's happening. You just know, okay, I'm supposed to do this because this is the rhetoric we've been told. Like we're supposed to serve at our own expense, even if it's tough. Right.
Exactly.
And I think they blur the lines where there's no lines drawn at all. And so you're there, you start off your morning unlocking the church with your dad at like, what, 7:30 a.m.?
I believe that's what the time was.
Right. So you could be there before the pre-group comes at 8 a.m. You pray for an hour, and then you go into corporate prayer. And then after corporate prayer, you go into Sunday school.
Yeah.
And then after Sunday school, you go into main hour service.
Yeah.
And then you get a break and you have to come back for evening service.
Exactly.
So your whole day is preoccupied with church. And my issue that I had with that, because I had a hard time distinguishing it growing up, is that they didn't there was no boundaries whatsoever.
Yeah.
There wasn't any time for you to take a break, to recognize, hey, is this too much tasking? I mean, you're 12 years old. It's not really something that you should even contemplate. That should be leadership's responsibility. So that is, to me, that's one of the the wildest examples from our upbringing. And it's one thing to volunteer for something like that, but then to have that expectation laid on you, that's pretty difficult.
And then not only that, like after Sunday school, you know, most of the time I would be hosting, you know, welcoming people in at the door. And that's like, I love doing it, but it also was, some days it was like you're scheduled for it at the young age of 12 years old. And it's like, oh, I'm scheduled for it. Okay, you know, but what about the days I'm mentally exhausted? You couldn't really say no.
Right.
You know, and that's where, like you said, like the boundaries. Like you couldn't really say, oh, I'm not really feeling that great to hosting, like, and welcoming people in right now. Mentally, I'm drained, you know, because once you were said about that, it's like, oh, well, what's going on, you know? And all these different questions would come up. And that's where it was like, okay, you know, so many questions, you know, like I'm just want a day to rest, you know, and like you said, going from all day and you're trying to figure out where do you draw the line. And you, at a young age, you couldn't really draw the line because you were so young. And like for me, being so young, it was like, how am I supposed to say anything, And, oh, mom and dad, I'm tired, let's go home already. You couldn't really say that.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like, but you really wanted to, because it's like you have one thing after the other, and you're like, okay, when does it stop?
Right.
So.
And I think one thing that brings out too is that no, there's no concept of lines drawn. Like they can, as long as they feasibly see fit, they can keep pushing that boundary to make you do more and more.
Exactly.
But the worst part of it is, did you feel like your spirituality was tied to whether you would or wouldn't do those things?
I feel like it was, because it's like, well, if you are this spiritual, then you can do it all, and that's what it felt like the persona was. It's like, oh, well, if you're really in tune with God, you can do everything that we ask of you. And it was like, but how are you supposed to do everything for God, in a sense, if you don't really have the energy, the bodily energy for it? Because God doesn't just, ask you, oh, you're going to do all these different things. No, He expects of you, yes, certain things. But when you're mentally so drained from everything that you do, how are you supposed to give even more?
Right.
And that's where it like, okay, where do you draw the line to be like, okay, I need to take a step back?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing is that they made that your responsibility. And it's really it should be leadership's prerogative to care for members, especially if they're volunteering, right? Like we're already expending our energy, our resources. It should be leadership's responsibility to say, hey, like maybe we should have you slow down. Let's have someone help you. But I think what's pretty, I would say, I guess let's say it's manipulative that they at such a young age tied your service to the church, your ministry, to your how spiritual they perceived you to be.
Exactly.
Because if you were to deny or say like, oh, I don't want to be involved, and we saw examples of this, right? People that stepped away, we were made to feel like they were missing something, right? Or they were stepping away from God. Like, oh, they don't want to be involved. They don't want to be in choir. Like something's going on in their heart.
Yes.
And I'm sad that I partook of that mentality for a while, but it's how they make you view the world. And then you feel guilty when you're not serving.
Yes.
And if you take a break for yourself.
Exactly. And it's like seeing people be treated like that. It was like, it kind of did feel weird in a sense. And it was like, well, why are they being treated any different, if they're going through, say, a death in the family or anything going on at home? Like, why are we to judge? Because we're not the judges of them. And that's what we were taught is like, well, since they're not doing these things, what are they doing? What are they doing for God? And it's like, well, what if they need rest,
And it also implied when you think that way, and we were made to think this way, and ministry thinks this way, that if you're not involved, then it reflects somehow poorly on your spirituality. Like you don't have a close relationship with God. And we feel justified to take that stance. And now, of course, now we know, that's a very dangerous stance to take because there's no way you can tell anyone's spirituality just purely based off of like how involved they are.
Exactly.
But anyone who grew up in the UPCI, and especially at our church where this was really exaggerated, that they know that that's how they were made to feel.
Yes.
So I think that leads perfectly into our next question because a lot of people will make the comment when anyone talks against the Pentecostal church and UPCI, they'll say, Well, you don't represent the people that were truly involved. Like you were on the periphery, or you didn't follow the rules to a T, so you
Hmm.
can't speak up on the subject. But I mean, I think this clearly demonstrates that from a very young age, you were involved. You were
Yeah.
um, adhering to all the standards, the rules,
Hmm.
and you were sincere,
Hmm.
right?
Yes.
Um, One of the things I remember is you were often recognized publicly by James
Yes.
in church from a very young age. He would, account it to like your sensitivity to the Spirit.
Hmm.
Um, what did that recognition feel like for you as a child?
It felt like, like I said before, it felt like being seen, and as a child being seen, it's like, oh, well, people are looking at me. And it goes into another fact of like, well, oh, well, if I'm being seen, then I get, more attention from the pastor and this and that. And it's like, well, if you're being used and put out there, it's like, well, what can I put out there? And well, I have to be a certain way. I can't be any type of like, oh, I can't ask these questions, or I can't, do anything wrong. And that's where it was like, okay, well, if I'm going to be used, I want to make sure I'm perfect.
Yeah.
And that was always the thing, is like, at a young age, it was like, well, everybody has to be perfect. But then when you would go home, you're like, well, I'm not perfect, and growing up, being always the one that was like called out, for being so sensitive to the Spirit and being sensitive to, anything that came across. It was like I loved being so sensitive, but I also loved getting in touch with God. But it was also not because of Him, and it being recognized, yes, it was nice, but it was also something that was like trying to, well, in recognition, oh, well, look at them, look what they can do. Maybe we can use them later on. And that's how I felt like it was portrayed a
Yeah.
lot. And being put out there, it was like, okay, well, everybody's now looking at me, and well, I can't make any mistakes. And if I do, oh, what's going to happen? And that's where it's like you get this people pleasing attitude. Well, what can I do to do, I need to make sure my hair looks nice. I need to make sure everything I have on me looks nice and perfect. And that's where, like, as it going into a teen, it was hard because it
Yeah.
was like, I'm not perfect. And I would talk to God, and I'm like, well, God, I'm not perfect, but they're wanting me to be a certain way
Yeah.
all the time. And growing up, you have emotions and you're like trying to deal with them, and you're like, okay, well, what can I do? Because I don't want to. We're always told, like you said, pushing them down, pushing all those feelings down. Like, no, you can't have those feelings. You can't do anything, and you have to be this certain way, or you're not spiritual, or you're
Right.
not a certain way. Like you have to put on this facade all the time.
Yeah.
And that's where it was like, you can never be too emotional to the point where it was like, oh, what's going on?
Right.
Something going on at home or anything like that. And so that's what I felt like growing up. It was a bit hard to be always put out there because you were supposed to be perfect.
Right. And it's an inordinate burden that they put on select people,
Yes.
right? Because I'm sure you probably recall from your peer group, not to call out anyone in particular, but in
Yeah.
general, we know that there were these exceptions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you get called out from the pulpit and you're extra sensitive to the Spirit,
Mm-hmm.
so you have these expectations laid out on you. Like, well, I got to dress to the rules to a T.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say anything negative, and I got it, like you said, people pleasing,
Mm-hmm.
and you suppress your feelings. But your peers, you know, they didn't have the same expectations, and they weren't being
Exactly.
pushed to the same levels, and yet you still feel that responsibility, that weight.
Yes.
And I think it's kind of it's confusing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Very.
And one thing too that I think that's interesting about that is all of the guilt and the people pleasing behaviors that you impose on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
They're all based off of what I would say now is probably considered arbitrary.
Yeah.
Right? You're like, I have to dress a particular way. And when I say arbitrary, I mean in terms of your spirituality.
Exactly.
Right? So you tied your spirituality how well you dressed, how what's the word I'm looking for? Like how willing you were to say yes to people giving you tasks and stuff.
Exactly.
Right? But that doesn't really tell you anything about someone's spirituality, right? No. You know, just because you're involved in a lot of ministries and you're dressed perfectly to the rules, you know, you could have your dress all the way down
to your ankles.
Yeah. Hair stacked to the sky, all the stereotypes, right? And then you could have the worst spirit and personality and be mean, vindictive. You could be a gossip.
Exactly.
All those things are pervasive, but those things don't get addressed. What gets addressed is, oh, well, Elizabeth didn't dress properly, and so we're going to call that out. And now she has to step down from ministry, right? So when James prophesied about you over the pulpit that you would become a missionary, can you give some context behind that story first? And then how seriously did you take that?
Right. So first when he was talking about the ministry or missionary, it was like trying to, you know, put out there, oh, well, we're going to be going to Africa soon. And, you know, it was
how old were you at the time, by the way?
I was around, I think it was 15, 16, I believe.
So you're 15, 16, and James, I don't know if he had pre-talked to you before that. But
he did.
Okay.
He did, yes.
But he kind of just threw this on you.
Yeah.
Obviously talked about it before announcing it to the church, but okay, go ahead and finish your story. I want to get the context.
So when we talked before he announced, we were talking about, you know, a dream that I had. And it was about going to Africa. But I've always, at a young age, I was prophesied to be a missionary one day through another person. And it was, you know, always told to me that, you know, one day I would be in the missionary field. And so I had talked to him about it because I was like, you know, I have this, you know, heart. Like I want to help, you know, I want to do anything I can, you know. And growing, when we were trying to talk about it, he was like, yeah, definitely. And then I was like, yeah, we could talk about it more. You know, I wasn't expecting to like really go, you know. But then he was like, oh, we're going to have a team together. This is when he was announcing it to the pulpit. He was like, we're going to have a team together and one of our young people are going to go with us. And he had announced my name and I was just like in shock. I was like, oh, I didn't think, you know, I was actually going to be able to go. And because it was like, I was, first off, very, very young.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was something that was like sprung on because I was like, well, I didn't expect to like really go, you know, right now, you know? And before, and then afterwards he had talked to me about it. He was like, well, I need you to do X, Y, and Z to make sure we prepare for it.
Yeah.
And that's where it was like, there was so much pressure to be even more, like, per se, perfect.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh no. You know, like it scared me a little bit because I was like, oh, well, I have to be a certain way. And I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready for that, you know, and
it's uprooting your life too, right?
Yeah.
Like everyone has like a normal trajectory and not like potentially you may have wanted to do that. Maybe you didn't consider it fully,
Yeah.
But now all of a sudden, like, okay, for sure, now you're going to go to another country, and who knows what that's going to look like, right?
Exactly.
That could be terrifying as a teen, right? To not really know what your future outcome is going to look like.
Exactly. And that's where it's like, well, what are we going to do? You know, like, is my parents going to be there? Like, how is this going to work? You know, and it's like, at a young age, it was like, he was like, no, we're going to make a team and, you know, all of us will be there. And I'm like, but at a young age, how are you supposed to expect of me all this responsibility?
Yeah.
You know, I'm only 16 years old. And it's like, how are you supposed to put that out there? You know, like, I thought we were going to discuss it. And even though discussing it was like, you know, it was a, how do you say?
Like taboo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, not really ready, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And so you feel pressure, and you're just like, okay, you're trying to come to terms with, I guess this is where I'm going in life. One of my follow-up questions that would be, well, I'll preempt it with this. I kind of suspect he singled you out because of how you had already demonstrated throughout your youth.
yeah.
You're very sensitive, right, in the way that Pentecostal churches would recognize. But maybe you could add a little bit more to that. What do you think specifically about you made James think about you for this role, aside from the prophecies or the dreams, right? Because I'd imagine that didn't come until he, like, did he know about the dream prior to you meeting, or he did?
Yes.
Okay. But you think there were any other factors that went into it as to why he singled you out?
To be honest, I'm not so sure about singling me out. Like, I feel like he wanted to put that out there to be like, oh well, I can use this to, like, almost like to his advantage.
Right.
To be like, well, if I put one of the young people in there, you know, all of the rest will follow. And I feel like being singled out into that, it was like, okay, well, she can make sure that everybody else in, like, around her follows into that, you know?
Right.
And not like they were gonna go, you know, but that they, like, fall into line of like, oh, they need to be like this. They need to dress a certain way, be a certain way, just like her.
Right.
And I feel like that was more portrayed so that we can do, like, all these things, you know, but it was like to an, like, I don't know how to say it, like, to an advantage to him, like, putting that into place so I can make sure everybody around me didn't question anything.
Right. So he set you up as like an example to your peer group, and also simultaneously he saw it as an opportunity to help push out his agenda. And we know we're now that we're older in our adulthood, we see what manifested from that, right?
Exactly.
Which now he's developed this, like, church network under his name that he's particularly proud of, and so it sounds like that was like the initial phases where he's trying to build out, and he's using you as a pawn to, like, okay, let me find someone, and this is my impression of what happened.
Of course.
You know, he must have seen you as, like, okay, she's very sensitive, she embodies all the principles of the church. If I can use her as kind of like a keystone to help build my agenda out, then everyone else will follow in suit. Right. So even if he tried to portray it as like he was trying to help you, in reality, it seems like, and it sounds like that it was really using you and your personality to help build him up.
Yeah.
Okay. And one of the other factors, and this might deviate into a different subject,
Of course.
I think it was important to bring it up because one, it was a big element of your life. I remember we talked about, and it just embodies everything that you grew up
Yeah.
it led up to that like point in your life that like you were seen as that individual.
Yeah.
But there were some other elements at play,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're growing up. You had mentioned that you were homeschooled, right?
Yes.
And you were almost entirely surrounded by church people. Is that correct?
Yes. So that
Um,
was like my only type of community,
yeah.
because being homeschooled at a young age, it was like I didn't really have anybody to talk to or to be around. And the only option, was to be around the church.
Right.
And, that going back to the homeschooling, when I was pulled out of school at a young age, it was, and I feel like it was in an intent to isolate
Yeah.
in a way. I wasn't too great at school, but I did love it. I did want to, go further in school and, learn more of what I could do, and most likely it was like there was a lot of families around us that was homeschooling at the time. And that's where, my dad came into play of like, okay, well, maybe we could do it like them. And he pulled out, my mom from work and we all, and she was like in shock, like, well, I've been here for so long, and we're trying to, build ourselves up. But how are we supposed to do that with also homeschooling? And homeschooling, it was a lot,
Yeah.
and it was very isolating at times because all we had was, my brother and, my other sister. And it was just like so scary because it was like, well, I have nobody to talk to about anything,
Yeah.
and it didn't give me any opportunities to do anything in life. And that's where it was like super scary to be alone and not be able to talk to anybody but your parents, And so when you came to church, it was like, oh, I have to do all these things because I'm like, okay, all my friends, some of my friends were homeschooled. Oh, you want to hang out? Oh, maybe we can't, and that's the restrictions that we had. It was like, well, yeah, you might be homeschooled, but we can't really do certain things. And I'm like, oh, okay,
So it was pretty narrow even within the church group.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's pretty intense. So like your parents were pretty, like they were screening for people that were like potentially not fully invested in like the homeschool culture.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's, that's like a second layer of isolation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think why it's important to highlight, because I experienced that a little bit because my parents pulled me out of public school and put me into a private school,
Mm-hmm.
a Christian school.
Exactly.
And what ends up happening is you have nothing else to contrast your worldview and your life to,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so what you experience is what you consider to be normal,
Yes.
right? But had you, attended a public school and shared any bit of your story of like, well, I had been prophesied over and I'm going to be a missionary after, that might be received differently
Exactly.
by the outside, and it might make you question.
Mm-hmm.
Would you agree?
I definitely would agree.
And that's not at all to say that like you wouldn't still go through with becoming a missionary, but it would give you at least a little bit of pause
Mm-hmm.
to consider like, is this what I should be doing with my life?
Yeah.
And maybe that's why isolation is leaned into in these movements.
Mm-hmm. Because they don't want you to question anything.
Right.
And that's where it was like going back where we couldn't really question anything. And that's where it was so hard because it's like, well, how are we supposed to grow in life and as adults, And since growing up in it, it was like we didn't have any option, And it was so scary at times because you're like, well, I don't even understand, because we can't ask questions. We can't do anything unless it's, like our facade has to be perfect. And I feel like that's where they put the isolation in play so that we didn't have any questions to ask.
Right.
So,
Yeah, you're not given an opportunity to ask questions, and because of the isolation, you wouldn't even have a really good basis to even form questions, right? Because that is your reality,
yeah.
right? It's so intertwined, you don't realize that. I remember there was a time before we left the church, and this is like your late teens, my early 20s,
Right.
where we were at church from like 8 a.m. to almost like 3 to 4 p.m.
Yeah.
continuous. And people think that I'm like exaggerating when I say this, but like
Yes.
it was literally you'd start at 8
Mm-hmm.
and the pastor even today, he has this little break, like 12-minute break between first and second service. So you might get like a break at like 1 or 2 o'clock. And then they had this little break room where you could get like Cheez-Its and like
Yeah.
soda or whatever.
But even then, it was like for only certain people.
Right.
Yeah. And it was like, oh, if you're not involved, you can't come in here.
Right.
You know, and that's where it was like, oh, well, and that's where you were saying about the spirituality is like, oh, well, you know, I'm involved. I can do these things.
Right.
And that's where it was like, well, why doesn't it happen for everybody? You know, like if you're a church that wants to help everyone, how are you supposed to like single out only certain people? You know, oh, well, they're very mightily used.
Right.
Let's, you know, put these things in play to make sure they're comfortable. And it's like, okay, but if we're not, you know, we have to just wait around to make sure that, you know, we're ready to receive what they have to offer.
Yeah. And I distinctly remember that culture, because what it does is, you know, remember that game as kids we would play, what was it called, like slapjack, right? And
Yes.
you want to see whose hand's on top. Well, that culture bred that amongst the members. So inadvertently or purposefully, maybe.
Yeah.
I think maybe purposefully, they made us to feel that way, so that even though, like, so for the example of like that little break that we were given,
Yes.
the people that went in, they were like a select few, and they were
Exactly.
seen as holier because they served. But even within that group, there was this even smaller group that was like, I'm even, and maybe they wouldn't say this, but like they saw themselves as even more spiritual. So they forewent going into the break room, and they were cleaning up the sanctuary, vacuuming, and it was just this like, I gotta one up the next person and show off that I'm holier. And I don't doubt the sincerity of some of these people. I have
Of
more
course.
criticism towards leadership than the people, but the reason I feel like they were doing that and that we were made to feel that way is because leadership didn't draw back and say, no, that's not healthy. They let it happen because it benefited them.
Exactly.
And so you would be like, okay, you know what? Remember how we had 2 services? So to add context, our church, traditionally most churches have a morning service, and then they'll have an evening service later in the day. We combined ours and made 2 services in the morning. And so if you were involved in ministry, you would start your day at like 8 a.m.
Yeah.
And by the time you got to the second service, it was almost like 3 or 4 o'clock in the day. No lunch, no breakfast, if you didn't just get it at home. But there was this pressure that was put on a lot of people. Like, if you're really, really holy, they said the second service was optional, but it wasn't really optional behind the scenes. They expected you to be at both.
Exactly.
And so people that left and they didn't attend both, they were like, oh, they're not dedicated.
Dedicated, yes.
They're not committed. And so you would exhaust yourself because you felt like, if I don't do this, they're going to see me in a negative light.
Exactly. And that's, you know, as a young age, it was like trying to, well, I want to be here so they can see me.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I want to be seen so that, you know, we could be used, you know? And it's like, well, we're not, you know, if you're drained that day or not feeling well and you want to go home, it's like you're, you know, as a young person, it was like your parents be like, oh, you're fine. Just, you know, go over there and, you know, stand up. You're good. you know,
Yeah,
and
suck it up, right?
yeah, suck it up. And it's like, well, mom, you know, like I'm really, really hungry or anything, like physical needs, you know, and you're like, oh, well, we're going to go eat afterwards. We're going to, you know, have our family come with us and everything. And it's like, but how are you supposed to tell them how you feel when you're always in different things and you're like, well, we can't leave just yet, you know, because we have to put this out there that we're in it, you know, we're spiritual enough. And I'm like, well, I don't think that's what spirituality is really about.
And that's actually I agree with that. I think that's the crux of the problem with that culture is it tells nothing about your spirituality.
No.
Like literally zero.
Yeah.
Maybe it might showcase that you're more dedicated in the sense of like, I'm more willing to volunteer time because, you know, that is needed. Like ministries do need volunteer
Of course.
effort. But I mean, you could be doing all kinds of like obscene things behind closed doors.
Exactly.
And still do those things and then still be considered spiritual. And so it's a false positive. Yeah. Right. You can demonstrate to people that I'm holy, I'm spiritual just by playing that game of spiritual slapjack of like, I'm going to make sure I do more than the other person. And it really mars your view of one, the person of God, right? The way the Bible described it, who's compassionate, long suffering, who's not willing to see that any should perish, right? Scripture says. Right. It changes your view of that God that's all compassionate and gives unconditional love. Of course. To now it's conditional. Yeah. Like how much God will use me and how much God loves me is tied to how well I perform and how well I do. And you have a rubric by comparing yourself to other people. Yeah. Like, okay, well, you know, I'll just put Sister Sheridan, a random person, not a real person. Sister Sheridan, oh, she's involved in nursery. Yeah. She's involved in Sunday school. But me, I'm doing both. Plus I'm in choir. Plus I'm on praise team. You know, plus I do youth ministry. And so like it becomes a hierarchy. Like, okay, I'm holier. More. Exactly. Yeah. And it does happen, and people will try to deny and say, okay, that's not part. We don't do that. I think you grew up in it. It's hard to deny. Yeah. That was happening. Exactly. And it's like, who is going to do more, you know? And even as a young person, it was like, oh, well, you know, I'm in this, you know, and that's where it comes in. It's like, well, who are they going to call out next? Yeah. You know, and who are they going to put all this pressure on to, you know, put out there? And most of the time I was called on because, you know, as my family, they were always involved. And that's where it was like, oh, well, what else can I do to be used? You know, if I'm called out and I'm being used here and here and here, oh, well, then, you know, it'll help, you know, further my ministry. But it was like, but then it came conditional. Like, oh, well, you know, you're not doing this in this area, you know? Yeah. And the goalpost kept moving. Yeah. And that was the thing, is it was always shifting. So even if you were following a trajectory and you're like, okay, I'm a young 12 to 15-year-old girl and I'm following the rules to a T and I'm being involved in ministry, well, they can shift that goalpost and say, you know what, I didn't see you praying hard enough the last couple of Sundays. And so you feel guilty and you feel like, okay, now I got to really pour myself into the altar calls every time there's an opportunity, even if the sermon has nothing to do with it, right? They could be preaching. And this is something I think that's kind of ironic, I guess, maybe not funny. That might be a little mean to express it that way. But like, you know, they would preach and they would say like, you know, it would be an innocuous sermon. The sermon would be like, you know, God is great. And then everybody would clap. Yeah. And then altar call would come and everybody, and the response is always the same. Everybody would just like bawl their eyes out. Like, you know, this sermon's about humility. Or I don't know, I'm trying to think of something even more innocuous, like tithing. You're like, oh, we should tithe. And then at the end of service, everyone's bawling their eyes out at the altar. Yeah. It's like, are we expected to do this every single service? Yeah.
And I feel like that was the expectation.
Yeah.
Is because, well, if you don't go to the front, are you holier than them?
Yeah.
And if you don't show that you are spiritual enough, and it's like, well, even if I'm at my chair, I can still pray. But it was always told over the pulpit, no, you need to come down to actually meet God.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, if you're not crying your eyes out on the floor, knees down, everything, you're not doing it right.
Exactly. And that's a lot of pressure because
Mm-hmm.
one, it's like humanly, we're not supposed to like be in that kind of distraught mental state
Exactly.
week in and week out.
Because it's so draining to your physical health. And and you probably know this, is like when we would do that right after service, we would be so drained. And I'm pretty sure, there's all our family would be. And it's like we're giving, but then when it's time to like really rest, we don't have that time.
Yeah.
And because we have to go right back into it, and we have to do it with a smile, because if we're not doing it with a smile, then there's something going on.
Right. And yeah, that eventually there's no way around it. That leads to burnout.
Mm-hmm.
And I even liken it to like, this is a pretty dramatic comparison, but people that are drug addicts.
Yeah.
They initially, when you get that first hit of a drug,
Mm-hmm.
they describe it this way, that it's euphoric, right? It's like the best feeling. And then I think of that like an altar call, right? Like a
Mm-hmm.
particularly good altar call. You got a really good sermon. You felt convicted and you cry. It feels releasing, right? It feels powerful. But if you're expected to do that every single service, just like the same with the drug addict, eventually at some point, that feeling begins to fade and dull.
Yeah.
And it becomes routine.
Mm-hmm.
And so for them, they have to seek out stronger doses of that drug. And the stronger the dose, the worse the symptoms.
Yes.
And in the spiritual sense, every time we were pushing our emotions to that high level, it might be warranted in a certain state. Like maybe there's a sermon that particularly talks about like how great God is, and that moves you emotionally. But we going to keep pushing that feeling week in and week out? And, you start off at 10 years old. One day you're going to be 20 years old and 10 years will have passed. Will that emotional beat still feel the same after 10 years? Or will it feel a little dull where you feel like you have to drum it up? Like, okay, let me start getting it going again.
Yeah.
And it loses its value if that is just an expectation you're supposed to do all the time.
Exactly. And that's like, as you say, it loses your value. It loses its value is because it's like, well, if you're expected to always do it, how are you supposed to really be sincere?
Right.
And when you're sincere about something, especially with praying, you don't always have to be on the floor bawling your eyes out. And that was our expectation, is that, well, if you're not on the floor bawling your eyes out, you're not doing it correct.
Yeah. And I think a good analogy of this would be, with you being a mother, you probably can attest to this, but like if every interaction with your son was always ended up with you teary-eyed and crying, right? Like, this is such a beautiful moment, right? Like everything from like, taking him to the bathroom, giving him a bath, or just like sitting in a park bench, right? It would become exhausting, right?
Of course.
And then when something genuinely, there are moments in our lives where like
they took their first steps, they said their first word, they, any of those moments. And it's like, well, what is the value in it?
Right.
And that's what I feel like it comes about. It's like, well, like you go back to the value of, well, who or what, like, how are you going to determine that you're so, spiritually inclined, And it's like, well, I want to make sure that I'm valuing every single moment that I have,
Yeah, and tears is not always the representation of that. Like,
Exactly.
and that's one thing you mentioned it earlier that, like you said, you could be genuinely sitting in the pew and just contemplative, like no tears. You're not verbalizing anything. You just have your head down.
Hmm.
That could be you. You there's no way no one could. There's no way anyone couldn't say that you weren't being spiritual,
Exactly.
except in Pentecostal circles. That to them is a sign, like, oh, there's something wrong with her.
Hmm.
And it's the same in life, right? Like, if you say you climb, you know, a really large mountainscape, right? Like,
Yeah.
say you get to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro,
Hmm.
and you might have an emotional moment at the top, and if it's just you by yourself, you might just like let out a sigh, like,
Like
wow,
taking
I
it in.
accomplished that. It
Yeah.
does that mean that was any less impactful because you didn't start bawling your eyes out and start rolling on the mountainside? You know what I mean?
No.
Right. And I think it sounds ridiculous like that,
Hmm.
but in context of a Pentecostal church and the altar call,
Yeah.
they can't distinguish those things.
Hmm.
It has to always end up enrolling, and it just becomes dull after a while. I
Yeah.
mean, I think people learn to get accustomed to that feeling,
Hmm.
and a lot of times it's just for show.
Yeah.
Um, and that I think that's pretty sad, and it's dangerous to your spirituality, I would say.
Exactly.
So we kind of established here that you've led up into this point in your life, into your teens. You followed the rules to a T.
Hmm.
You're wholeheartedly sold out to the doctrine, right?
Yes.
And you don't have any questions. You might have some inklings of questions,
Yeah.
but you haven't really been able to have an opportunity to kind of follow them through,
Hmm.
right? So you're in a sense locked in.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk about the transition into early adulthood and some things that transpired. And before we go into it, I want to say first and foremost that the church stigmatizes a lot of things that happen.
Yeah.
And I think that is so unwarranted. It's so damaging. So before we go into the story, I want to treat it with the utmost respect.
Of course.
I'm not saying anything disparaging, anything like that, even though the church likes to turn that image, to turn situations like that into that image.
Yeah.
These are things that is just a part of life, right? That's what I would say. So with that being said, I want to transition to the next question. In your early adulthood, you're still pretty young.
Yes.
Walk us through what happened when you found out that you were pregnant with your son. And how did the church leadership react, and what pressures were put on you?
Right. So when I was first announced, and not even announced, when I first found out, it was hard and the pressure was there because it was like, well, you're supposed to be a missionary. You're supposed to be perfect. You're supposed to do everything correct. And I found out, I was pregnant, and I was like only 18 years old. And of course, that's such a young age, and it was like there was so much of a stigmatism around it. It's like, well, yes, we're not supposed to do any of those things until you're married. And it was like, well, some of the things weren't even talked about to us at a young age. And even if they were brief, and it was told, you're not supposed to do that until marriage. And that was it, And it was never really, really talked about of, pressure or anything like that. And when I did find out, and I had told, my parents, of course, it was very, very hard. And then, of course, after I told my dad specifically, he was like, well, we need to make sure the ministry knows. And that was the hard pressure that came. And after that, when the ministry was told, I was told, that we were going to have to announce it. And I wasn't expecting, anything really. And, well, he ended up announcing it over the pulpit, in front of everybody. And that wasn't just an announcement. It was like, oh no, you have to stand up so everybody can see. And that's where it was like all the shame came down on my shoulders.
Yeah.
Because it was like, well, this is what happened and this is who it is. And being always the one that was like called out, at a young age, it was hard to stand up and feel all that shame because you could feel it.
Yeah.
And it was really, really hard to understand what was going on. And it was almost like shock, in a way, to be like, oh, well, she's pregnant at this age, and I wasn't the only one that was told to stand up. His dad was also told to stand up as well. And that's where it was like so diminishing in a way.
Yeah.
Of like not only my character, but like it brought up so many things of, I don't even know the word, trying to really understand what was going on.
Right.
And not only after the announcement, prior to the announcement, it was like more of a waiting period. And that was like, oh, well, we're going to announce it soon. And I was like, okay, and that was the question when I popped in my head, why are we announcing it? And you can't really ask those questions, but it was like, if you wanted to, and I'll go further into it after, it was announced, so many people had came up and asked all these different questions, and I was just like bombarded. Like if it was in a thing to be like, oh, well, don't bother her, but, in a backward, how do you say it? Like,
Yeah, like a backwards way of
yeah.
He set up the stage for them
Yes.
to ask you.
Yes. And that's what the hard part was, is that we were standing there and I'm like, I don't know what to say, because it's like, it's nothing to do with anybody else. And that's the hard part, when it was like the shame that was put on us because of, our actions or whatever. And it was just like almost like if you were ripped of everything that you had on, like almost. And that's how it felt.
Yeah. And it's such a terrible culture that has developed in the UPCI, I would say, and other like very strongly fundamentalist like evangelical churches. And it's so unwarranted. There is no reason. I think a lot of people would support this. That should have been divulged to anyone.
Yeah.
That is a deeply personal matter. It served no benefit to be shared with anyone in the church, much less in that kind of a setting.
Exactly.
It was, even though they try to frame it this way, and I'm sure they'll hear this and try to like, oh no, we were doing it to, avoid gossip. Like you said, it did the opposite of that.
And everybody wanted to know what was going on.
It alerted people that would otherwise, it wouldn't have even crossed their mind to think or talk about. Which I remember being in the audience, because I had no clue that this was going to happen.
Yeah.
I knew about the pregnancy, but when they announced to the church, I was, honestly, I think I shared this with you a little later.
Yeah.
I was appalled. I was shocked. Like, how dare they do that? And this is something that they had done before. Like, you weren't the only one.
Exactly.
And side note, like for the church being so stringently like strict about rules and stuff like that, it's kind of interesting how prevalent that was at the church, right? Even like high profile families.
Yeah.
That was happening. So it's like, maybe you have a problem with your like teaching if that's happening so often.
Exactly.
But it also shows how common it is.
Yeah.
Like that it's not a life-ending, it's not a life-ending sentence.
Yeah.
It's bringing in life
exactly.
to the world. It's a beautiful thing. It should be celebrated.
Yeah.
And they instead turned it into this finger wagging, pointing, and shame. And like you said, it made you feel bare in front of everyone. And I'm sure it must have been felt embarrassing, a lot of shame and guilt.
Exactly.
And you were describing it, and I thought of it like it felt like you got onto. It must have felt like you were just latched into a roller coaster,
Yes.
and you're like, what's going to happen next? And as you come out the tunnel, you just see all this tremendous loop that you're going to go down, and it's
Yeah.
like, I didn't sign up for this,
Exactly.
but you have no choice because that's the culture of the church.
Exactly.
And I think that must have been terrifying to know that was always going to be looming, because he didn't tell you exactly when he was going to announce it to the church, right?
Exactly.
Or that he was going to have you stand.
Mm-hmm. And that's where it was like, it was a shock to be standing. And I was like, I thought it was just going to be mentioned. And even then I was questioning why it was going to be mentioned.
I think we talked about this, but I'll give you an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit more about the impact following that event, because it must have been devastating.
Absolutely.
How did being publicly singled out affect your mental and emotional health, both immediately and long term?
I feel like immediately it was really hard, you know, and there was so many emotions, of course. And it was like, you know, friends would come up and be like, what's going on? And, you know, like, was it because I wasn't there for you? You know, almost like in a sense, like it was on them. And I'm like, you know, this was something that was, you know, never really spoken about. And, you know, it wasn't trying to do anything. And that's where it was like so deeming to like my heart and like my mental health, like trying to really focus on the emotion. And it was like, why am I such in a shock, you know? And going like immediately after, it was like shock, and then it was like, oh, this was shaming, you know? And really recognizing that it was shaming hurt a lot. And to be honest, I didn't really recognize it until a lot later on. And it was just like something that, you know, well, they have to announce it because it's going to be shown, you know, and, you know, you make excuses for the leadership to have announced it. And, but then it's like later on, you're like thinking about it, you're like, no, I think they had an agenda to announcing it. And that's why it was so hard to really wrap my mind around the emotion. And it was more of shock than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think absolutely you hit the nail on the head.
Mm-hmm.
That it was their intent to shame.
Mm-hmm.
It was for their agenda. And I think one of the ways that best exhibits this is that seems to be the only sin that they highlight to the church.
Yeah.
Right? You imagine if someone was like arrested or like got indicted for embezzlement,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's no pastor going like, okay, we need to have brother Edward.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was caught for embezzlement. Let's have him stand and let's all look at him.
Mm-hmm.
And just know that he got caught for embezzlement or whatever innocuous thing. We're not doing that for everybody. We only do it for cases of pregnancies
Mm-hmm.
or out of wedlock. And why do you think that might be that especially that the stigma is mostly attached to the female?
Yeah.
To the woman. I'm sure your ex-husband now,
Mm-hmm.
your boyfriend then, did he feel as much pressure, you think, as you did?
To be honest, no, I don't think so. When we had talked about it, he was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "I didn't expect us to stand, you know." And he was like, "Neither did I." And we weren't told that we were going to stand, and that was the pressure. And he was like, he was more concerned if I was okay, you know, because we weren't expected, because I was the first one told to stand. And it was hard because it was like, well, yeah, because she's the one that's pregnant, you know? But it was like, how are you supposed to do anything after that? you know?
Right. And I mean, that ties from the earlier point, how
Hmm.
that you were highlighted from a very young age. And for many years growing up,
Yeah.
you're extra sensitive to the spirit. You're being singled out for ministry. You're going to be a
Hmm.
missionary. After this announcement,
Hmm.
what happened to those sentiments about you? Was that expressed again? Did people talk about you in terms of like what are you going to do for ministry hereafter?
It was expressed that, it was going to be on pause because they wanted to make sure I was focused on being a mother. And,
Okay,
I respected it, but I also was like questioning why, and I was like, being a mother doesn't stop anything,
right,
and yes, the sentiments of trying to like be a missionary and do all these different things in my ministry, it was like, well, you can't be a mother and be a missionary, and I was like, it was hard because it was like, okay, well, that's fine, it could be on pause. But then, later on, it was like almost like shuffled to the side, like if it was never going to happen. And that was like, in shock because it was like, well, we talked about all these things, and it was like, oh yeah, we'll try to get to it maybe to a later date. And but it was more of like, we're not going to do that because of everything that happened. And I was more in like devastation, but I was also like, well, is this how you treat everyone,
right.
you know? And that's kind of where it was like going into everything about my life. Well, what are we going to do next?
Right.
And it goes into the fact of like, am I allowed to stay? You know, and what are the next steps for me?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that it also highlights too that while it left you there questioning,
Hmm.
what's left for me moving forward,
Hmm.
it demonstrates that everything was tied to the image that you were portraying.
Yeah.
And it literally for them only took one action,
Hmm.
one event in the span of your life to undo everything that they had built you up to being.
Yeah.
And it shows how fragile that spiritual system, that faith system is,
Hmm.
because there is no grace
Hmm.
and forgiveness to be able to like move on from that moment, because they expect for you to suffer for a little bit,
Yeah.
right? They want you to embrace that shame
Hmm.
and let people gossip about you. And because certainly they weren't telling people like don't talk about this anymore.
Yeah.
They say it from the pulpit, but we know
Yeah.
what happens, and it does stigmatize you for the future. Like, well, she's limited now.
Hmm.
What she can do, except I mean, there are people that like we go back to the brother Edward example.
Hmm.
He commits embezzlement, and it could be as quick as the following week.
Yeah.
He could be announced as like the associate pastor,
Hmm.
right? But for you, you're expected to hold off, and your spirituality now is wounded
Hmm.
from a public perspective. People are like, okay,
Exactly.
she's lost out with God. She needs to work her way back up, even though practically nothing. Most of your personality and who you are is unchanged,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned this too as we go into the next question. You said that you notice that there were some individuals who experienced like similar failures, like, and I say failures in quotation marks,
Hmm.
similar situations.
Yeah.
Were they treated differently afterwards than you were?
I feel like they were treated somewhat differently, but also same. It just
Yeah.
depended on, like you said, on your rank. And being as, yes, we were always involved as a family, it was like some of the people that were in situations like me, got more grace, and that's kind of what hurt because, you know, they weren't told, oh, you need to make sure you're with the other person, you know? And it goes into the next thing of like trying to well, what is next? And, well, who and what, were they going to do? Their ministry is not unchanged,
Right.
but mine is. And that's where it's like it becomes your rank of, well, who is better? And your rank in the church of, oh, well, this family is more known and, as you said, wealthy, like who's more higher than the other.
Yeah.
And that's where it's like, we weren't really as known, even though we were, used everywhere. We weren't as known.
Right. And I think that does, like, as much as people will deny it, and especially in those in the movement, it has to be acknowledged that is the case, that there are specific families that are treated as elites, that are affluent, that happens to be like, it can't be coincidence that like most churches in the UPCI, most of their leadership predominantly are business owners, doctors and lawyers, right? Like the most affluent in our society coincidentally are the ones that are leading the most prominent ministries in the church. And yet, not to like have a pity story upon ourselves on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, but like I remember feeling like, okay, why am I only relegated to like doing janitorial work?
Yeah.
And so-and-so who happens to own a business is preaching every Sunday, right? And
exactly.
We don't see him stacking the chairs after service,
no.
Right? And so I think it goes the same in that hierarchy. You mentioned that, like what I saw, maybe you might not have seen personal examples of this, but like if a man in the same situation, had a moral failure with their partner, right, like their significant other,
You're right.
The female takes on the brunt of the shame, and is relegated to the side, whereas he is still highlighted like, well, you know what? God still got something for you, though.
Yes.
If you keep pushing and pressing, and they'll immediately be put back into roles of leadership in a ministry.
Yeah.
And it shows kind of a double standard that they have, where women are favored less over men.
Of course.
So we kind of talked about family status. I think another element of that is financial giving, and people brush over this fact, but I mean, that logically that has to play into it. If you're a church or you're a church member and you own a business and you're raking in $1 million of income, and you give 10% of that versus someone lowly that's like, working a low-end job,
income,
and they're giving their same 10%, is it coincidence that the person who gives 10% out of $1 million versus the 10% out of like $20,000 a year, who gets favored in the church? Or is that purposeful, right? That person coincidentally is the one that gets highlighted the most and recognized by the church.
Exactly.
Well, I won't dwell on that too much because I know that's a sore spot for like the UPCI, because they're like, oh no, we don't do that. And it's like, I think we know better, but
yes.
Despite that, though, like we'll move into the next question just to kind of move forward from that, unless there was anything else that you wanted to add to that.
No, definitely not.
First Church pushed strong holiness teachings, but there seemed to be a lot of secret behavior that didn't match up to that. Would you agree?
Yes.
How did that contradiction affect your view of the church's teachings?
I feel like it was always told that we had to wear, our skirts down to a certain length or our hair a certain way, or we couldn't cut it, or we couldn't wear certain things like jewelry or short sleeves or, do anything, as women, we like, doing our hair or doing our nails, or those things were very frowned upon, because it was a holiness standard of trying to make sure that everything is in a perfect way, and you have to always be in holiness or you're not spiritual. Like, oh, well, she has her skirt right at her knee. I don't think that's very holy for a lady. And trying to really understand that growing up, it's like, even as an adult, it was like, you know, I like doing my nails, and it's just something that's just a girly thing, but it's also frowned upon, like, oh, well, you're going to make that an idol. And it was always told that if you make that an idol, then you're not spiritual enough to, be a part of what we're going on here.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting because it's very specific in our specific tradition, right? Yeah. Especially First Church, because we were known to be ultra strict comparatively. Like, of all the other UPCI churches, they knew that First Church or James Jackson's church was very, very strict. But it's funny, as we got older, I started thinking as to like what constituted this is holy and this isn't holy, right? Because a lot of times it felt arbitrary. Like, you gave the example of like if the skirt is just at your knee. And what we know now is that there are several churches in the UPCI where that standard is different for respective churches. Yeah. So you go to one church and the rule is like, okay, it can be 1 inch beneath the knee or 1 inch above the knee or no split at all, or it has to be a 1/2 inch split. Like, there's all these arbitrary rules that are different from church to church.
Exactly.
But to each church group, they're seen as the holiness spiritual level meter. If you're not doing that 1 inch beneath your knee, you're not holy.
Exactly.
But at the other church, because the rule is the 1 inch above the knee, you're still holy if it's 1 inch above the knee. So it's like, it's contradictory. And then you brought up the nails as an example, right?
Yeah.
That could become an idol. Who's to say, like, where do you draw the line as what constitutes an idol, right? Like, there's this culture in the UPCI of like, so they might dress holy according to this rules, but they definitely have a culture of like pageantry, of dressing up and having very special, ornate, and like flamboyant dresses. And I have nothing against that. Don't get me wrong, because I think women will like attack me, like, oh, you don't like us dressing up. But my question, and you can comment on this after, but like, why is it okay to wear like a floral dress that has like sequins on it and maybe like beads and stuff? But then immediately, if you decide to wear earrings or a necklace, that's the cutoff point.
Yeah. And I feel like it was like seen as like, oh, well, this is, just a nice dress, and it's like showing, like, as I said, showing off, and I feel like it was almost like a talent show, like who's wearing the better dress. And when it came to like, oh, well, you're wearing like the super nicest stuff, like, what is it? Designer. Like, say you're wearing the designer shoes of the season, and it's like, but you can't wear rings or you can't wear a necklace that's super, super nice, and it's because it's like, well, that's different. No, not really. It's kind of in the same, because you're trying to one up somebody.
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, I'm better dressed and I'm more holier than thou. I'm not wearing jewelry because we're not supposed to adorn ourselves with anything, even though that contradicts, in the Word of God.
Right. And it's they cherry pick the scriptures as to what they'll focus on. So they focus on, you mentioned, well, I think you were alluding to like getting to like the hair.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so Pentecostals, we won't have to touch on all the biblical elements of it, but they believe in uncut, long hair, right? Well, the same scripture that alludes to that also says that you're not supposed to braid it either, or put costly array or weave into it like gold. And yet in Pentecostal churches, we see they do braid it. They do very ornate hairstyles. Like, of any Christian denomination, Pentecostals are like widely known for the crazy hairstyles of
and the tallest hair. Yeah.
And it's a very unique culture. Like, if you compare it to like the Baptist tradition or
Mhm.
Presbyterian or all these other church groups, like Pentecostals are known not for like how sweet and special and kind they are.
Mhm.
They typically known for either how crazy their antics are,
Yeah.
or by how the women are dressed.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's ironic because they'll highlight that and then have no issues with like a woman wearing like a designer bag,
Yeah.
which like if I put a Coach bag around my neck that has gold on it, it's a necklace,
Mhm.
right? But if I hold it to my side, it's a purse,
Yeah.
right? What's the difference, right?
No difference.
It's totally contradictory. You're still using the vehicle of fashion and
Mhm.
dressing up to draw attention to yourself,
Exactly.
which is what they are claiming
They
that
don't want to do.
they don't want to do.
Mhm.
So to me, I feel like that is one of the biggest hypocrisies
Yep.
of the Pentecostal movement, and it's something that they need to address.
Yeah.
Because it's quietly consuming, I think, a whole generation or generations. This is like it's been around now for a few decades.
Yeah.
And you experience that, right? Am I
Yeah.
wrong? I think it's funny because people get upset if I attack that.
Mhm.
Because like, oh, well, you don't want us to dress nice and look nice. It's like, no,
Yeah.
I actually want to give you the freedom to do that, and even more so, right? And so, like, if you want to do your nails to enhance the way you dress,
Yeah.
you should be able to do that. And if a man wants to wear a suit like with pinstripes and like add a Rolex watch to it,
Yeah.
in Pentecost churches, it's like this weird game of like, what can I do and what can I do?
Exactly.
And honestly, if they want to be holy,
Mhm.
they should look at their peers in the Amish community.
Mhm.
You know, if you really want to be holy and subdued and modest, and not just like modest because of like your dressing,
Yeah.
like tone down your sexuality,
Mhm.
modest in terms of like showcasing how much money you have,
Right.
you should dress like the Amish
Be
or
more
like,
humble with
right.
it, and not, oh, well, I have all this money, let me show it off, and that's where it comes in with rank. You don't want to do that because it's like it's contradicting everything and you're trying to one up somebody, and it's like in the Bible it says be humble, and that's how we're supposed to be as Christians, and it's like, well, if you're wanting up somebody, how are you supposed to be a real humble Christian?
Right. Exactly. And it encourages it too. That's the problem, is that
Mhm.
culture encourages you to do that, to
Yeah.
discard other people in favor of like, I have to look better and be better. And a lot of times how you do that
Mhm.
is you have more access to resources. You can buy better dresses.
Yeah.
You can buy better suits and better cars,
Mhm.
which is a pretty big culture too in our church, is
Mhm.
who comes in the fanciest and the biggest and the most
Yeah.
chromed out cars.
Or the newest this or that,
Right. And maybe I shouldn't go into it. I was going to say a side note. I might cut this out, but the side note is that our church, you remember this culture. I put out a video recently about this too, where our former church, our pastor, cult leader James Jackson,
Yeah.
has this fascination with cars.
Yeah.
And I put this video out about how he was prophesied that he was going to get this like $100,000 like just massively expensive vehicle, and that it
Yeah.
was like he was entitled to it through God's prophecies,
Mhm.
as if God was like that superficial and
Yeah.
materialistic, like, oh, I'm going to give you cars.
Yeah.
That's how I bless
Yeah.
like this motor
And
coach.
that's not how it works.
Right.
Like, it's like, why do you think that you're so holy to get, oh, well, if I get the best car, then you know who I am.
Right.
And it's like, well, it's not really about you. It's about God. And it's like, God gives us blessings in time, but it's Him giving them, not, oh, I'm going to get the best car. Like you said, he loved cars. And he was always saying, well, I can get one for every day of the week, And it was crazy to me because it's like some of the people in the church didn't even have a car.
Right.
And that's so like, well, wouldn't you humble yourself to you know, I have a nice car, but I'm not going to be flashy with it.
Yeah. And it also warps your view of God.
Yeah.
It makes God as materialistic and superficial as you, right? Like God is only concerned about like the pile of gold in my backyard,
Yeah.
like how big my house is. It makes God like this consumerist. He's like a consumerist like everyone else. Like it makes God sound like he would love going to the mall or something.
Exactly.
You know, like and just buying Rolexes and Louis Vuitton. It's like it's kind of a petty view of God.
Yeah. It is.
That's how, instead of thinking of blessings in terms of like my ability to contribute back to my community, God has blessed me so much that like the same $300,000 you have to spend for one car that transports one person, you imagine if James instead was like, God blessed me so much that I could give this money to help feed our community, to help people in need. And of course he'll hear that and he'll like counter it with like, oh, you don't know what I do behind the scenes. It's like, why is that the thing that you highlight?
Yeah.
You highlight the car, but you don't highlight how you're helping families, if at all.
Yeah.
And so it twists the view of God, and the church members adopt it because now they're thinking, oh, I wish I can get blessed with an Escalade.
Yeah.
I wish I can get blessed with a Mercedes. And it's like, what about blessing with a happy and fulfilled life with your family, contentment in a 1-story, 2-bedroom home? Why is that not blessing?
Exactly.
You know, and it's really sad to chase that. And that's your whole life is, well, I'll finally be seen of God when I have that car in my driveway. And those things are so temporary.
Yeah.
And so meaningless in the grand scheme of life. Like, you get tired of a new car.
Yeah.
Like, literally, even in finance, a car loses its value the moment you take it off the lot.
Yep. And
we're putting all this weight into like, okay, God's going to give me an Escalade. And the moment you get off the lot, the car dealerships, they don't care. That car has already lost like 50% of its value.
Yeah.
And you've made your spirituality all about obtaining that momentary, superficial thing.
Yep. It was so crazy.
So anyway, sorry, I went on a tangent that wasn't in the questions, but I might keep it in. We'll see.
Yeah.
So let's go back to your relationship. James called you out, and we know that it was used as a moment of shame.
Yeah.
And it was inordinately just focused on you as the woman. And now you're pushed into a marriage, right? Like, was it pretty fast going?
It was so all about the relationship. It was like, you know, we were told that, like, you know, right after it was announced, we were told that if we wanted to stay, that we had to get married. And, you know,
And stay at the church.
Yeah, we had to stay. Like, if we wanted to stay at the church, we had to get married. And if we didn't get married, we had to leave. And and it was so hard because I was like, that was my whole life. You know, I grew up in this, you know, and being told, well, if you don't do what we say, then you can't be here. You know, and it's so hard because it was like in a shock, like, oh, I didn't know that I was going to have to do another thing, you know? And it was like becoming a mom, not only just becoming a mom, but I have to become a wife now. And it was so much pressure on it. And it was like, you know, if I don't get married, then I can't be here in what I love and what I enjoy. And my ministry, what is going to happen to that? You know, if I don't get married, you know, and it was so much pressure to get married. And it was so heart-wrenching because it was like, well, if I don't, then I'm not allowed to come back.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And I think they use that as a mechanism of control. And we know that now that we've left the church, we've been quote unquote marked.
Yes.
And they use that as a fear tactic to everyone else that, like, if you don't fall in line with our rules, and particularly with James Jackson's rules, then you will lose your community.
Yeah.
And that's not arbitrary. That's actually pretty devastating because like in your case, that's all you knew,
Yeah.
right?
That was 20 years of my life, and it was so scary. It was a scary moment, trying to be rushed into something that, we wouldn't expect. Because it was like all this pressure of like, well, what are we going to do now? And then it's like, oh, well, you need to get married if you want to be here or even have a ministry here. And that was like, all right, let's do this. And I was so scared to do any of it because I was like, well, first off, I'm becoming a mom. Now I'm having to become a wife. That's a totally different, thing. And it's also like all the different emotions with it because, of course, you're growing a child and now you're having to be pushed into a marriage and it has to be perfect because we want to make sure that, it's as to God's standards that, oh, well, you need to make sure that you look a certain way because if anybody comes in, why are you a single mom? You can't have a ministry if you're a single mom, and that was, I feel like, growing up, that was kind of frowned upon in a lot of situations. And that's why I was like, okay, well, I better get married. If I don't, then, I won't have any, say or any ministry at all.
Yeah, and I think that's really it's devastating to hear because you were made to believe or you were made to view that decision in terms of how it affected your position in the church.
Yeah.
And not question things like, am I compatible with this person?
Mm-hmm.
Is this healthy for us?
Yeah.
And how will this help me in raising my child?
Exactly.
Right? They made you, instead of questioning whether these things were healthy and good for you or if you were even ready for it,
Exactly.
they put in the forefront of your mind of thinking of, well, I don't want to feel shame. I want to try to repair my view amongst my church members, my church family, and I want to be back in the good graces of the pastor.
Yeah.
And it's so sad because the pastor, if he was truly to be a good shepherd, someone that cares for his flock, he would be more concerned about whether or not you were ready for that responsibility and to help guide you through that.
Exactly.
And so that might lead into my next question is, do you feel like they prepared you at all in any way for what marriage would look like and like how you would prepare in becoming a mother?
Yeah.
Did they help you in any way?
We did premarital counseling.
Right.
And that was like the only way of, preparing us for it. And it was like, but even then, it was really, really hard because, moments we were both trying to figure out if we were even ready for it. And when we were doing the counseling, we had to do, I feel like, a little bit more than most people because it was a different situation than most. I know that y'all did the marital counseling, prior to y'all's. I feel like ours was a little different because of, we were expecting already, before a marriage. And that was, okay, well, you need to be ready for this and this. And it was a little different for, I feel like, my experience. We were told we really need to be ready. And we were trying to see if we were compatible. And some of the things were like, oh, well, we're not very compatible in certain areas like communication, which is a very, very strong thing that you need in a marriage.
Probably one of the most pivotal things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why it was like, I didn't learn that going back to growing up, I didn't really learn that because we were always told we had to be a certain way and we couldn't really ask questions. So it was like there was never really a communication there. And so going into the marriage part, it was like, yeah, well, you might be able to communicate a little bit, but it wasn't always, a way where it was like healthy. And that's where it was like, well, even though it's not healthy, it should be okay and it should work. And that's what I feel like my thought process was then, being, I guess, a little naive, and well, I was like, well, it should work even though we both aren't really prepared, and, being pressured into it by the church. It was like, well, I didn't feel like we were really, really ready. But I was like, well, if I don't, then, I'm going to lose everything.
Yeah. And to add some context to that too, so they gave you premarital counseling, and this is something they do for everybody.
Yeah.
One, it was really rushed, right? Like obviously as soon as they learned you were pregnant, they were like putting you on track to like, okay, now we got to get you married. And did they give you how long was the period from announcing pregnancy to like wedding day?
It was like, I think only 4 months.
Oh, wow.
Which is crazy. And it's very, very rushed. They were telling me that, that we had to be married before the child was born because they wanted to make sure that if anybody were to show up or to be around like new, that they made sure that we were married before I was, had the child.
Yeah. And I think, and it has nothing to do with you. You were told all these things, right? And you were guided into it. But from a leadership perspective, I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's kind of silly.
Yeah.
It's all for public. It's all for appearances. Like they wanted to get y'all married to kind of fool everybody into saying, okay, they're a functioning and healthy couple.
Yeah.
Who just had a child, and we can forget.
Yeah.
That they had the child prior to marriage, right? And so it's this arbitrary thing just to present to people who frankly shouldn't have that much say in your life anyways.
Yeah.
It's like Brother Edward, he's 75. What does it matter how he thinks of you? It's your life.
Exactly.
And yet you're being rushed to this position. So 4 months is wild.
Yeah.
And it also, the second thing I was going to bring out of that was that you talked about premarital counseling, and someone might hear that from the outside, like, oh, well, they did prepare you. And you think about it, I mean, the premarital counseling wasn't the entirety of the 4 months, right?
I don't believe so.
Like you're meeting like once a week or something like that?
Yeah, it was like once a week.
So if you added it all up, I mean, it wouldn't add up to like, a month of meetings.
Yeah.
Right. But if you go to school and you're meant to like, okay, say you wanted to learn to become a doctor or a nurse, you would not accept someone into the medical field if they've only had like 4 weeks of training. And yet they launched you into a lifelong commitment with someone that you weren't entirely prepared to be with, or you didn't even know whether you would be, based off of maybe like 5 weeks of like, how long were the sessions? Were they like?
Only, I think, about an hour.
Yeah. And it woefully leaves you unprepared. And they'll say like, oh no, we told them. I wouldn't take that, like I said, in the example of a doctor, if a doctor only had like 5 weeks of 1 hour sessions, I wouldn't let them treat me.
Yeah.
And yet they're expecting you to kind of just throw you into the ocean and like, okay, I hope you can swim.
Yes.
That is wild. And that at least is some support. We'll give them a little bit of credit. Like, okay, maybe they gave you a little bit of counseling. And I know the individual had do the counseling. So the counseling wasn't from the pastor, right?
Yeah. No.
It was from one of his sub-associates.
Yes.
And So after you guys get married, you're rushed into it. You have a little bit of information that they've given you. There's no way they could have told you everything.
Yeah.
And it's probably slanted too, right? Like they're not telling you, they're not telling your now ex-husband how to be a good husband. They're telling you how to be a good submissive wife.
Exactly.
Right. It's all one-sided. But after you get married, what was your relationship like? Was it the white picket fence and the bed of roses that they were hoping it would be?
Yeah.
Or did things change dramatically afterwards?
It did change dramatically. After we did get married, there was a lot of, abuse. And it wasn't really like physical, it was more of an emotional, verbal, because we thought we were ready. And it was, growing up, both of us didn't have the communication that we needed. And going back to the communication, we didn't have it. And that's what my concerns were. And you can never question it. And it was like, it's going to be okay, And not only did it deal with the verbal abuse, it dealt with, cheating. And those things weren't really brought up in the counseling or anything like that of how to deal with it. It was always told, well, you just need to be a good wife and to sit back, and let your husband lead, while you're at home or whatever, the stereotypical, wife, good wife, even if there's certain things said or arguments, you don't want to show that. And so, a lot of it was hidden for a very long time. And, after trying to really, really understand what was going on, because it was like, I thought it was going to be perfect. I thought it was going to be a different way. And it wasn't. And it was more of what we had been through, as our younger selves, that was really, really coming out of both of us. And we both didn't understand. And the communication came really, really into key. We didn't have great communication because of, growing up, it wasn't there. And so trying to really, really understand what was going on was hard because we were always told to push our emotion down and to, no, you can work it out, everything will be pushed to the side, and that's where it was like, well, how are you supposed to understand what you're going through and what you're experiencing, if you're pushing it aside or pushing it down, and that's when it came to it got more intense in trying to understand everything. And we both really, 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 tried, but it also came down to, well, what are we doing, and, trying to understand how to, in a sense, leave.
Like leave the relationship or leave the church?
Leave the relationship, and it was like, well, I can't leave the relationship because if I do, would I have to forfeit the church as well?
Right.
And that's where it was like the fear of, that persona being taken away again, and the shame that it would give if I did leave my relationship. Would it look bad on me from a church point of view, or would I be even allowed to be there anymore?
Wow. Yeah. That's terrible, and it pushes people to stay in unhealthy relationships longer than they should. And you had no resources. It sounds like that there was no resources afterwards, right? Like you're not getting counseled afterwards about, the strife that you're having between you and your husband at the time. No one that you could channel that out towards.
Yeah.
You're internalizing it and you're suppressing it, and they incentivize it because you know you don't want to lose your community, you don't want to be ousted from the church. They incentivize you to present a different facade at church. When you both are attending, you almost in a sense have to pretend that everything's good on the surface, but you know when you go back home that you're dealing with what you said was emotional and verbal abuse. And it got pretty intense from what you were sharing with me before, right?
Yeah.
And it's terrible that the church, instead of like giving you resources or sitting you guys down and saying, hey, you know what, let's check in again, you know, and let's talk about what emotional abuse is, what verbal abuse is, and how to handle it.
Yeah.
And if it's justified, right? They don't even have that discussion at all. And you're meant to just figure it out some way.
Yeah.
But the only option that's off the table is you can't leave it.
Yeah.
You have to stay in it. And that's so sad. It must have been very, you mentioned, you said you mentioned the word depression earlier.
Yeah.
It must have been very depressing and very difficult to shoulder all that by yourself.
Yeah, and it did feel hard to really understand. And there were so many questions at that time. You know, well, if I do certain things, is it going to be looked frowned upon? And that was like the fear of, like you said, losing community, losing everything that I ever knew.
Yeah.
And it was so hard, you know, staying in a place where it was like, I know this isn't right, but if I don't, then how am I going to, you know, do life, you know?
Yeah. And the sad thing is if you had stayed in that system, and thankfully you left, and we'll get to that eventually here in a moment, but if you stayed in the system the way that they wanted you to and the way that they funnel most people, I can't imagine that you would have any sense of peace or happiness. Like you would be probably miserable.
Yeah.
And if that carries on for 10, 20, 40 years, and I have strong suspicion that there are probably a lot of people in that movement that were in the same position as you, that were made to feel like, I can't leave this. And you have to suck it up, internalize those feelings, and that gives the other bad actor the license to continue to abuse, to continue to harm. And that's not good. And I mean, that's not even biblical.
Exactly.
So we know that there's some conflict in the relationship, and you recognize that there are things that are wrong, that are abusive, but you really don't know what to do.
Yeah.
But something did change at some point, right? Was there a specific moment or maybe a series of moments that it clicked for you that something was deeply wrong with the relationship and maybe even like you're tending the church?
I feel like when I finally clicked, it was after so many times of really, really trying, you know, and we were told, keep going, you know, and, you know, y'all's relationship is perfect, even though we knew that it wasn't. When I finally decided, it was a little after we, you know, separated from the church. And that was when I feel like I found my freedom, you know, because I was, and not only just freedom, but like understanding, because it was like everything, like you said earlier, was tied to the church, was tied to your spirituality. And once we left the church, it was something, you know, that was able to understand all those emotions, like, oh, this isn't right, you know. And it was like if a mask just came off, you know, and it was like, okay, now I know what I have to do. And it was so freeing, you know. And, looking back, it brings so much clarity, of being able to leave a cult and being able to leave something, might bring more clarity to what you have going on in your life.
Yeah.
And, that's where there was so much trauma from the cult that it was like we didn't even realize, that, oh, we're being told that this is correct and it's not. And in a sense, it was like being relieved of everything that you could understand, and it was like so freeing.
Absolutely. And I know I experienced it, me and your sister, my wife, Laura, we experienced the same thing when we left.
Yeah.
Because the cult redefines reality.
Yeah.
It has its own definitions of how you're supposed to interpret interactions in the world. And if you're isolated, right, you don't have any outside connections, you're not consuming outside media. It's very easy to see how people learn to just go with the flow and then accept things that are harmful to them.
Yeah.
And as soon as you lift those blinders, like you said, lifting that mask, you begin to be able to define things, especially as you get exposed to teachings about, healthier spiritual churches, right?
Yes.
Or healthier spiritual environments.
Yes.
Or you learn, like things sometimes get over spiritualized in church. Right? Especially Pentecostal churches, like everything's spiritualized. Like you drink coffee and it's too hot, and they're like, "Oh, what's the Lord telling me?" It's like, no, you just drank it too quickly, right? But that carries into different parts of our life where, you instead of like recognizing that, oh, that person is narcissistic and manipulative, you try to codify it with the spiritual terminology. Like, well, if I just pray hard enough, I'll fix them.
Yeah.
If I have enough altar call moments, it'll correct them. When in reality, there's some things that just might need therapy.
Yeah.
You might just need to talk it through with a clinician.
Exactly.
Or you might have a genuine issue, right? Like if you, if you say theoretically you had like an iron deficiency.
Yeah.
And nobody knew, right? Like you're just like, oh, I always feel tired and sluggish.
Yeah.
In those environments, you internalize it and you turn it into a spiritual thing. Like, well, maybe I'm not praying enough. Maybe because I wore pants one time and God is punishing me. When in reality, you need to see a doctor.
Yeah.
And you need to get treated.
Exactly.
And a lot of times the treatment is simple. Right? I'll just take this pill and you'll feel better. Or change your diet. You change your your fitness regimen.
Yeah.
And so you take that like example and you can extrapolate that to relationship conflicts and issues.
Yes.
And instead of getting the practical help that you need, you're being told instead, no, just stick through it, push through.
Exactly.
Endure the abuse, endure the verbal, the mental turmoil, and things will just get better. And we know that's delusional thinking.
Yeah.
You needed real, practical
therapy.
Help.
Yeah. And that's one thing that I wish we were taught, and it would have saved a lot of heartache.
Yeah.
And it is something that is unfortunate, because being told as a kid, once you get married, that's it. You're done. You're never taught divorce is okay. And sometimes it's like when you don't know if you're ready for it, ready for the marriage, and you're being pushed into every single thing, how are you supposed to know that you're compatible, like you said? And, that's why so many people, they put so much stigmatism around divorce and being separated, and I'm like, sometimes God has different plans.
Yeah.
And, sometimes it is to be a single mom. Sometimes it is to have two separate households. And that's okay. you know, and I feel like there's so much stigmatism, like you said, in the church, in Pentecost, that you have to be a certain way and you have to be with the one that you're having kids with. And yes, you know, it is a good thing to be with that person because, you know, you want to be able to be a family, you know, and, you know, growing up, that's all I wanted,
Yeah.
you know, and I feel like being rushed into something affected all of that.
Yeah.
And, you know, even though I wish it turned out differently, and even though it didn't, it's okay. You know, being able to be a co parent with somebody is amazing, you know, and now he gets even more love, you know, than what we assumed, you know?
Yeah. They want it to be like a life sentence if
Yeah.
you step outside of their definitions of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's ironic because when you look at the Bible, a lot of the characters throughout scripture that God used were in multiple different variations of relationship. And we
Yep.
don't like, discard them,
Yeah.
right? You know, you can go through all the examples. Like Moses was a murderer,
And
right? And I'm not
David.
comparing those things. Yeah,
Yeah.
David was a murderer. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you talk about King Solomon. I mean, you talk about a marriage that's, you know, contradictory to
Yes.
scripture. Like, I mean, he had like hundreds of like wives and
Mm-hmm.
concubines, and yet he's known as the wisest man in the scriptures, right?
Exactly.
Paul was single.
Yeah.
You know, he had no spouse,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so to think that God is so narrow-minded that he can't use someone
Exactly.
because of their marital status
Mm-hmm.
is so silly. And it's even contradictory within their own movement because so I don't know if you know this, but in the UPCI, the ministers,
Mm-hmm.
a license, you can't be licensed if you've ever been divorced,
Oh,
technically.
really?
But we know. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sure that's why it's shocking because
Yeah.
a lot of them are divorced,
Yeah.
and
Exactly.
nobody cares.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because they acknowledge, for the men at least,
Mm-hmm.
that that's okay. That was your past. For women, there's another stigma.
Mm-hmm.
But they can't even keep it consistent within their own ranks,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not. It doesn't even reflect in the Bible that way.
Yeah.
There's people that were used in different capacities, different relationships. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
people. Jacob. You know, married two different women, right?
Yep.
Like, you know, why are we trying to narrow God down
Mm-hmm.
into this really small box?
Yeah.
When there is more richness in our existence, when God can just use anyone,
Exactly.
and it doesn't devalue your life in any way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you mentioned earlier, of course, maybe there are things that we would have preferred.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's these general things that we all kind of
Yeah.
aim for, but it doesn't mean that life is over if you didn't fit that mold.
Exactly.
And the church, it just this toxic thing that has continued to pervade for many years, that they make people feel terrible for not meeting this very ultra specific mold.
Mm-hmm.
So we're drawing closer to a close,
Yeah.
but I want to kind of follow up on. So you've now acknowledged that you've left that relationship, right?
Yeah.
So at this time, you and your ex-husband, y'all are separated,
Mm-hmm.
And you've also now left the church.
Yeah.
So, well, first, can you tell me what led you to leaving the church?
So, you know, when we were still together, it was, you know, just a regular Wednesday. You know, we had just lost my grandfather, and it was really, really hard and a really, really tough time for my whole family. You know, all of us were really grieving at the time, so we didn't show up for one service, you know, because we wanted to be able to grieve. You know, but we were, you know, we always were told, you know, if you're at home, you know, use a live stream, So that's kind of what we did. And it was like the day before, like a lot of things were said. We were, watching the live stream like a normal Wednesday. And we were, told over, it was told over the pulpit that, y'all were no longer welcome. And when everything was
You talk
told,
about me and Laura.
Laura, yeah. When y'all were told like y'all weren't welcome, it was hurting. Like it, pit in our stomach because that's my family you're talking about. And the diminishing of, who y'all were was, devastating because I was like, that y'all are talking about somebody that y'all were praising not only a week prior, and saying all the great things that they're going to be used in. And now y'all are saying something totally different, saying that y'all weren't welcome. And I was in a shock. Like, how are we supposed to continue?
Right.
And as a family, we were also grieving, and it was almost like assumed the reason we weren't there was because of, y'all leaving. And it was really, really disheartening and really, really hard to understand what they were saying because we were, that's our family. I love family. I'm not going to turn my back on my family.
Right.
And not only that, it was how they said it and how they diminished y'all. And that's how it led up to me understanding why am I allowing, somebody to talk so poorly on somebody that I love. Just imagine how that can open your eyes to something in the greed, about everything.
Yeah.
It's like we never understood that would happen, because we've seen it before. And that's why when it finally happened to my family, I was in a shock.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, now I understand the feeling of what it feels like to be pushed aside, even though it was slowly leading, the way up to that, And I was like trying to understand everything all in that moment. And when the shock wore off, it was like, okay, now I understand what we need to do and why we need to leave, because it was so toxic of not only just them, but saying how diminishing y'all were. It just didn't sit right at all, and understanding how it not only happened to y'all, but multiple people before that.
Yeah. And I mentioned that in other podcasts that I've done.
Yeah.
That a lot of people think, well, it was just a one-off case. Like you guys were just a random case. And there was probably something in the background that we don't know about.
Yeah.
And like, no, we just left. We didn't agree with what was going on, but we never verbalized.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, we weren't the first ones.
Mm-hmm.
Many people were leaving before us, and they were speaking disparagingly of other people as well.
Yeah.
And, you never can imagine that it's going to happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
We actually, Laura and I were thinking, okay, we're just going to leave and
go somewhere,
Yeah. Well, we even thought we might even potentially just go back to the church, but just like sit in the back row.
Of course.
Many people have done that before.
Exactly.
Right?
Like y'all just wanted to step down from a whole bunch of things that were, draining you. Like we go back to everything. It was so draining.
And so we did not expect that kind of response at all. And so it was shocking for everybody.
Yeah.
And I recognize that must have been shocking to you too, like you mentioned, but you eventually that leads to you deciding, okay, we have to step away. And that's a decision you make by yourself, or do you make it with, or have you already split from your now ex-husband?
It was So we had made the decision before we had split.
Okay.
And then, right after we made the decision to leave, it was not long after that we ended up splitting, our relationship.
Yeah, and like you said earlier, it's like when you leave the cult,
Hmm.
your eyes are open and you can have a more sober assessment of things. You're like,
Yeah.
okay, this relationship was not working out.
Yeah.
And it was actually dangerous
Hmm.
and unhealthy.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you know, had the courage to recognize that and make
Yeah.
the decision that you did. Because even outside of the cult, that's still a difficult decision to make.
Yeah.
But the cult certainly didn't make it any easier.
No.
So now there's one moment that I want to talk about that I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Which is you also had a similar outing moment.
Hmm.
And this is after we all kind of left, but I think you're
Right.
still maybe like you visited the church for one last event.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that's pretty shocking.
Yes. It was a funeral, and it was an unfortunate event, and it was to somebody that I looked up to as almost like a grandfather figure. He was always very kind, and it was so hard because, we were like best friends almost, and he would always, be there, to have somebody to talk to. And when, it was announced that he had unfortunately passed, me, um, and some of our family had decided to go. And I was like, it is going to be hard seeing everybody that, we, kind of left,
And this is the funeral that's being held at our
Yeah,
former church. Okay.
exactly. And we were, there, and we were, doing what everybody else was doing, worshiping, like as they did. They did a little, not like a praise, but like a song that, would help, lift the spirits in a way. And we were doing what we always did. And, later it was told that we were being unruly, and we were laughing and joking, and it was told that we were being disrespectful in a sense, and we were doing what everybody else was doing. But I feel like it was told that we were being unruly because they didn't like our presence there, and they were shocked that our presence was there. And it was hard to hear, because we were like, we weren't doing anything different than anybody else. And, it was so hard to hear because, we weren't really in the limelight like y'all were, you and Laura. And when we finally were, it was like, oh, they really did not, want us there, And it wasn't that we were being disrespectful in any way, because I would never, do that at a funeral, especially if it was somewhere that we weren't, welcomed. I would never do that,
Right.
And that's where it comes into like, well, they wanted to make us, like, portray us as disrespectful just to follow their own agenda. And which is unfortunate, but it's also like, the truth is we were doing praising just like everybody else was doing. And it's so hard to see that they want to portray us as like bad guys, just because they want their agenda to be followed,
And it's crazy because they claim
Mm-hmm.
to be the essentially the higher spiritual entity
Mm-hmm.
in that relationship, right? They're the moral center,
Yeah.
in their eyes, right? Like we represent the Bible better, and
Mm-hmm.
we're the holiest and most spiritual,
Yeah.
and yet they were looking for any opportunity to sever a relationship with a former member.
Yeah.
To villainize you rather than extend grace. Like, even if you did,
Yeah.
like, that's the thing is, like, I'm confident that you guys didn't do anything, quote unquote, disrespectful.
Yeah.
But even if you did, you're a grown adult, like, foreseeably, and I think, like, in his 60s or something. Like,
Yeah.
you should be the more mature one. And especially at the status and the role that you serve as pastor, and yet his ego was so wounded by people that left his church, his congregation,
Yeah.
and he used it as an opportunity to strike back, like reacting like a toddler would to being not having his way had.
Yeah, and he was folding his arms, on the platform, and it was so, like, crazy to see, like, wow, you really don't like my presence, just out of pride.
And that's actually that encapsulates it entirely. It is pride, because a truly humble pastor that has the interest of people's hearts in mind, they would stifle any inkling of the ego trying to spill out and just eat it. This quote unquote disrespect, like, he couldn't even tolerate, like, even if you were giggling or something like that, like that threw him off. That's terrible.
Exactly.
He should have the maturity to say, you know what, I understand they're young people, that these things happen, and I'm imbuing into them, I'm projecting into them intentions that I don't even know are true or not.
Exactly.
They could, I mean, obviously they came to the funeral, they were well intentioned, right? So immediately it devolved into something, I think, frankly, childish.
Yeah.
And so unbecoming of a pastor. I mean, didn't he say that you guys are no longer welcome? Like, he shut the door, like, definitively.
Yeah, and he told us, and even said, like, anybody that has been marked, and they are marked, officially, is that they don't want anybody marked coming even to a funeral.
Right.
Which is so bizarre, because those are the people that we even grew up with, or they mentored us, and it's just so crazy to me that he would go to such lengths to, push aside, a funeral, like, oh, we're not going to announce it anymore. So they make sure that they don't come.
Yeah. It shows that their heart is not for people.
Yeah.
Their heart is not for family, and that their relationships were always conditional and very surface level.
Yeah.
And it's so crazy, because you can't imagine that in your own, like, blood relationships.
Yeah.
Like, to just suddenly cut someone off, like, immediately. Like, in some capacity, they're going to always be involved in your life, and you recognize that. But for them, it's like, as soon as you don't agree and look like me and live like me and affirm my my cult leader, then it's almost like we never knew each other. And was that how you were treated when you were left? Like, did anyone try to reach out to you? Did you have, or was it like a cold?
Like, that's the one thing. Like, I tried to reach out to a couple of friends and, even family, to really see what was going on. And we were given cold shoulder, a little after, everything happened, we were given the cold shoulder from our brother. And that was the most difficult, and it was like if we were just nobody. And it was so distraught, because we still love them,
Absolutely.
very, very tremendously, no matter anything that was said, we always will, and still will.
And that's, I think that shows a tremendous maturity and like an actual, real, true, deep-seated love for family.
Yeah.
That even though they've discarded you, and they did the same with me, you know,
Mhm.
and I'm an in-law. You know, Laura obviously is related,
Yeah.
like in her family.
Mhm.
To give context to those listening, we still have a family member that's in the cult,
Mhm.
and they've disavowed us. They've cut us
Mhm.
off entirely. And I mean, he's your direct brother,
Yeah.
right? Blood brother. And, um, or, yeah, I know the relationship is a little different, but,
Yeah.
he's your family,
Yeah.
and we haven't had contact with him. I don't even know. It's been like,
Ever since that, it was ever since that day that even we were marked, like, me personally. And it was really, really hard, because he, ended up having a couple of children. And as the younger sister, I've always wanted to be an aunt. And that was the most disheartening because I was the only one, in our family with a child. And when we were cut off, she was, my sister in law was currently pregnant, and we couldn't even meet, my own niece. And that was so, so hard.
yeah.
And even to this day, I still, think about, what it would have been different, you know?
The cult stole that from us,
Yeah.
and most importantly from them,
Hmm.
because we are wanting to be involved in their lives.
Yeah.
We're not the ones that allowed anything to separate the relationship. It was the cult that told them
Yeah.
that they had to cut people off,
Exactly.
including family members that want to be there to support and love them,
Hmm.
like only a family can,
Yeah.
unconditionally.
Hmm.
And it's so sad. And anyone that makes an argument like, oh, they're not a cult, I can't think of a more plain example of that being a cult, to force family members to
Cut off.
cut
Yeah.
off people,
Hmm.
their own like direct family
Family.
members,
Yeah.
with like he wrote a letter saying
Hmm.
we'll never see you again.
Yeah. And
Um,
even though it was mentioning, he loved us, it just, he couldn't be around us because we were marked.
yeah, and that is something that you see in legitimate cults that everyone else will agree with.
Hmm.
You know that, okay, well, Jonestown, that was a cult.
Hmm.
They literally moved to another country to separate them from their families.
Yeah.
Um, but if it happens there, we can recognize it as a cult. But if it happens here, no, that's different.
Hmm.
That's not the same thing.
Exactly.
Except it is. It is the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's dangerous.
Hmm.
And that's what I hope, that this gets through to others in the same situation, that recognize, like, don't be in a place that puts you in that position.
Yeah.
Um, I digress. And that might be something, I don't know, I may or may not keep that in. Um, so I guess I'll collate a couple of questions, and this will be the final sort of talking point. Is now you've left the church,
Yeah.
and you fully separated, and they obviously have ill intentions of you. They don't want to see you again.
Hmm.
They want to have nothing to do with you. You've also left your relationship.
Hmm.
Um, Now you're in a healthier church, right?
Yeah.
Could you explain? Oh, excuse me. What that's looked like now? You deconstructing your old beliefs
Hmm.
and developing new ones in this healthier environment.
Yeah.
And how's that journey been?
It's been eye-opening, and I had about a year ago went through a class that they had offered, and it was called Freedom. And it was really, mentioning the deep wounds of, cults. And it really, really touched my heart because it was like something that nobody really, really talks about. And they were like, sometimes when things don't really, not say go our way, but things that happen to us that we can't control, and that not that God wanted it for us,
Right.
but how much freedom He will give us from it, and that's kind of what it entailed. And being able to be a Christian and being humble and not being so flashy all the time with everything. It is nice to like dress up every once in a while, but it's also like not looking at my spirituality in a way where it's like you have to do this or you're not spiritual
Right.
enough. And that's where, in the environment I am in now, it's where you get to have this relationship with God more like connection,
Yeah.
And it's more like what God is really about. And it's so like good to see the healthy side of like not being forced into something that isn't correct, and being humble in a way where you get to help people, and like not only just that, but like, teach them, this isn't scary. It's not supposed to be scary, and forced or prideful, this is something that you get to have and He gives us freely.
Yes.
And that's where I love and understand, okay, this is what you have for me. Being a single mom and being able to understand that it is okay to have a relationship with God, even though all my life I thought maybe I'm not good enough, and that's kind of how it felt, after we left. But now it's like the freeing sense that I am good enough and He can use me even in my situation, and it's so much more of a testimony
Yes.
to people, that it is okay, and it is okay to be humble and not always have to be some type of way that a cult wants you to be, and I enjoy everything that I'm doing now because I get to help everyone I come across.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautifully said. And I love seeing your journey now. You could see the improvement in the how the strides that you're making now. When they forecasted for you that things weren't going to go well for you.
Yeah.
And and life's a journey. It doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
mean that you can't stumble and make mistakes here on out,
Mm-hmm.
but you have the freedom and the grace to know that God never abandons you through that process.
Exactly.
And the greatest irony that of this whole schism of leaving the church is that they view themselves as, because of their strict rules and the way they behave and their culture, that they're better than everyone, that they're holier and closer to God.
Yeah.
And the irony is that actually all those things drive them further than God, to away from God,
Right.
than where you are now.
Exactly.
And you have that culture that it evokes pride. It encourages gossip and slander. It encourages ego and saying we have the truth, the exclusive truth, and everyone else is going to hell. It removes compassion. It strips people of their compassion and their empathy.
Yeah.
It makes people tie their spirituality to arbitrary things by like how long your dress is and that you don't wear makeup.
Exactly.
And it alienates you from people. You mentioned how that now you have the opportunity to help anyone.
Yeah.
There's no barriers to you because you're not looking at them and judging them silently like, oh, well, yeah, you're wearing earrings.
or
And it's
you
like,
have tattoos
right.
or anything, like the whole, like, oh, well, you're not wearing a long dress like everybody else, you're wearing pants, and that's the stigmatism around all of that, is that no, God brings so much peace when you understand what he's really about.
And he is about loving people. He's about compassion. I mean,
Yeah.
the whole thing we know of Christianity worldwide, and people get on my case about expressing the love and kindness
Yeah.
and compassion of Christ. They feel like it's too soft. Like, no, but he gave his life.
He did.
I mean, that's what we're known for. Literally, the icon of Christianity is a cross.
Yeah.
The self-sacrifice for people that, quote unquote, didn't deserve it.
Exactly.
For him to do that. And yet Pentecostals, they pull themselves away from society and they look down at people. It's the exact opposite, where they say, you know what, I'm sorry, you're just destined for hell.
Yeah.
And they try to portray like, well, we want to reach people. How does that reaching people if you alienate and you look down your nose at people for simple things, like just because of the way they dress?
Exactly.
What advice would you give to someone that may still be stuck first in First Church or in a church like First Church, who feels confused, shamed, or fearful of leaving?
I feel like my advice would be, look at your leaders. Look at all of the different types of maybe shame that they might put you under and you don't even realize it. And like the things they make you do. And that's one big thing, is that, well, I've heard that some of the people that we had grew up with, they were trying to be in a sport, and that was, no, you can't do that. And it's like, why are you telling somebody that you can't do a certain thing in their life because it doesn't go with your agenda? And it's like, that's not how God works, because they can reach people being in that sport. They can reach people in a godly way with being in something that can help them, and it could even further them to reach people, and give them opportunities that they wouldn't even imagine. And that's where it's like, I feel like people should really step back, and speaking to people that we grew up with, or I grew up with, because I know that it might look all perfect, but you gotta really, really look at it, because you might think, oh, well, he's calling me out, he's putting me, on this or that. But just imagine what he's telling you not to do, and that's where you really gotta focus on, because you don't want to be stuck somewhere or told to do something that you're not even comfortable with.
Yeah.
And it's not okay to do that. And that's where, when my story comes in, it's like, so many of my friends, or like say anybody that I grew up with, I hope, they really, really get to see, how it really, really went down.
Yeah.
And let them understand that everything behind the scenes, nobody really saw. And I hope they see that, before it's too late.
Yeah.
And before it brings more years that they're in it, because it is freeing once you really, truly understand that that's not okay.
Yeah.
To be in and to be looked down on, because all of us have a life to live, because that's what God gave us.
Yeah.
And he gave us the opportunity to spread the word, not to hide it. And that's where I feel like a lot of people really, really need to look deep down and understand the feeling of what God's love and compassion looks like.
Wow.
And what it doesn't look like. And, and seeing what pride really is.
Yeah, and I mean, Scripture deliberately says that pride cometh before a fall. It is a dangerous pathway to take, and it's sad that they don't highlight it within their own midst.
Exactly.
It's left to run rampant.
Mm-hmm.
And in those environments, ironically, steal all the things that you express that you get when you have a real relationship with God.
Yeah.
Right? They claim that you understand God's love deeper by following these rules that they're man-made, and to point and wag your finger and make people feel shameful.
Yeah.
That isn't experiencing God's love. That's drawing away from it.
Exactly.
And you putting yourself in the driver's seat and saying, I am the one that dictates, a gatekeeper of God's love.
Mm-hmm.
God gives love when I decide that their life is correct and according to the rules.
Exactly.
But like you said, when you leave, you finally get to see how freeing it is and how much grace God gives to let you go through your life.
Exactly.
And not have to live up to this perfection, standard of perfection, which frankly, if you can encapsulate all of the rules of Pentecost, that's not even remotely a perfect person.
Yeah.
They pretend like it is, but like there's so many things it doesn't account for. We'd have to make rules for so many other things. And really all their rules are tied to just dress.
Yeah.
That's so superficial. But I guess I'll end it in saying that I 100% agree. And just to summarize kind of what I think you were saying was that it sounds like what you would tell people is that it's, one, it's okay to trust your instincts.
Yes.
That like what you were seeing and the shame you were made to feel, and you recognize that this doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
That was something that is God-given.
Yeah.
That was like, hey, this is not right. And in those cultish environments, they tell you to suppress that.
Exactly.
Don't listen to that. And so that's great advice to say, you know what? Just dwell on that feeling. Why do you feel that way?
Exactly.
And then the second thing, and I think this is probably the most important, is you said basically evaluate your leaders.
Yes.
Question your leaders. And that doesn't mean that you question them and like, they like to portray it like, okay, you question your pastor because he didn't shake your hand. It's like, okay, no, we're not that petty.
Yeah.
But if your pastor makes you feel a certain way and you don't understand it, compare it to Scripture.
Exactly.
And a lot of times you're not given the license to even remotely think that question. And so that's great advice because the Bible will not lead you astray. If you seek it to find answers and to like compare it against your leaders,
Exactly.
you'll see where it contradicts. And that's what I did in my own journey. When I looked at the scriptures, there's literally stipulations as to what we're supposed to expect from people that call themselves pastors,
right,
and bishops and apostles, and they weren't lining up.
No.
And so absolutely, you have the license. You were never not able to question and look and consult Scripture and consult God in prayer.
Exactly.
So excellent advice. I love to see your journey. I love to see how well you've been doing. And I'm so grateful that we're in each other's lives.
Absolutely.
And your son being involved in his life as well. I'm very excited for your future and his future as well. So thank you so much again for doing this episode with me. And I hope it helps. And not only do I hope, I know it will help countless others that will tune in.
Absolutely.
So, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.